But first, legendary Chicago city planner Daniel Burnham once said, quote, "Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood." And Chicago has some very big plans in the works. Construction starts next year to extend the Red Line from 95th to 130th Street. And over the next decade, O'Hare will be expanded and modernized. Projects like those and others at the city and state level rely on federal dollars, funds that may not be as forthcoming under a second Trump administration. So here to discuss is Justin Marlowe, research professor at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. Welcome back to the program.
Hey, Sasha-Ann. Good to see you.
So we mentioned a couple of the big ones there, Justin, but walk us through what types of projects and initiatives at the city and state level typically rely on federal funding.
Yeah, so for context, at the city level, the city of Chicago next year is projected to spend somewhere in the neighborhood of about $4 billion on infrastructure projects. And about 15% of that funding, about $600 million or thereabouts, is connected to the federal government in some way. So it's a sizable number. And at the state level, it's even a little bit more. You think about at the state level, it's things like state highways, federal highways that are very expensive and take up quite a bit of the capital budget for the state as a whole. So it's 15% it's a tricky number, right? Because it's just enough that if you lose some of that money, it makes financing those projects difficult. But it's also not the majority of the funding, right? It's not enough of the funding that if that funding is reduced or goes away, that you have to rethink and walk back the entire project.
Right.
So it makes for a kind of a tricky financial situation.
And what departments are these funds going to mostly?
Well, in the city of Chicago, we can think of it in kind of cross-cutting terms, right? We typically think of it as less tied to specific departments and really more sort of citywide initiatives. So if you think about something like the Red Line extension, which we talked about a second ago, think about the O'Hare 21, the O'Hare passenger experience modernization process, the CREATE program, which is the rail modernization, particularly in the 75th Street corridor. It's meant to improve congestion and make rail freight move through the region more efficiently. Those are all kind of big projects that cut across all of city government. When we zoom out from just the city of Chicago, too, you think about a lot of the bigger projects that we've seen. When you would go to the Chicago Transit Authority, think about what's going on, not just with the Red Line extension, but a lot of the station replacements, the L station replacements that are in the works.
Right.
If you go to the Chicago Public Schools, go to the Water Reclamation District, a lot of the big wastewater, stormwater projects that they've been doing, particularly on the west side, all of this touches federal money in one way, shape, or form. So it really cuts across really all of city and state government, and not just city and state government, but a lot of these big regional governments on the whole, too.
Yeah, talk more about statewide, what we see there. Like, how much money does Illinois get from the federal government?
Yeah, it varies depending on whose numbers you're looking at. But roughly speaking, it's on the order of what Chicago receives as well. If you think about 15% of the city's capital budget, it's about the same, maybe a little bit more for the state. So it's you're in the neighborhood of $10 to $15 billion just on the major parts of the state highway budget. The Rebuild Illinois, which is with the governor's sort of signature infrastructure investment program, had about the same amount of federal money in it as the city of Chicago's capital budget has. In fact, a little bit more depending on specific projects. So you're talking tens of billions of dollars at a time. It's hard to know exactly what happens to a lot of that money. There's definitely the potential for some of it to be ramped up, potential for some of it to be scaled back. I guess that's what we're all kind of thinking about at the moment. But it's without question at the state and the local level a lot of money.
Well, let's zoom in on some of those big projects that we've been talking about, starting with the CTA's Red Line Extension project. Now, that's expected to cost $3.6 billion, which includes hundreds of millions from the federal government. Now, a lot of that money's already been pledged, Justin. So would you say that that's safe, so to speak, or could a new administration come in and rescind funds that have already been earmarked for the project?
Yeah, there's always the potential that the federal government decides to scale back some of those pledged dollars. Like you said, it's of the $3.6 billion, there's roughly half of that is expected to be federal dollars, FDA dollars,
That's a
Transit
good
Authority
chunk.
dollars. And of that, they've received somewhere about $750 million or so, which leaves about $1 billion plus that is kind of pledged, but may or may not arrive. And this is where it gets tricky. I think transit projects on the whole, we've seen are maybe some of the less popular projects at the federal level. Federal government generally likes transportation, particularly if we're talking about highways and ferries and rail, but less so much on things like transit. So I think of all of the big projects happening in Chicago right now, that's the one where there's probably the most, I wouldn't say a cause for worry, but definitely the one that we'll be watching most carefully,
Yeah.
that has the greatest potential for some of those dollars maybe to be pulled back. And again, in that case, that means the CTA needs to come up with those dollars on its own. And the CTA has, of course, its own big funding crisis that it has to attend to.
And let's not forget that, I mean, it's focused on transit equity, this particular project, right? This is huge. It's bringing public transit to an area that's had very little of it for a long time. And it's a project that aligns with the Biden administration's goals that, it might not be in line with the priorities, though, of a future Trump administration.
One of the things that'll be really interesting to watch on that is when you think about the potential impact the Red Line extension will have on the South Side, especially vis-a-vis the quantum computing stuff that's happening now on the South Side.
Right.
All indications are that the Trump administration is a fan of quantum computing. They see that as something that we should be investing in as a country on the whole. It could be that there could be a connection there. There could be a meaningful connection and a willingness on the part of the federal government to invest in transit just because of the unique nature of what's happening on the South Side right now.
Yeah. If you're just tuning in, this is Reset. I'm Sasha-Ann Simons, and we are talking about how a second Trump term could affect the money that Illinois and Chicago receive from the federal government and some big projects that could be stalled during the next 4 years with Justin Marlowe, who's a research professor at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. So I want to talk more about the O'Hare modernization while I have you here, Justin. So this is an even bigger project than that Red Line extension. 6 years ago, it was estimated that it would cost $8.5 billion, but that was in 2018 dollars, right? So chances are it could cost more?
Yes, excuse me, as is often the case with big infrastructure projects. So
much so you had to clear your throat
yeah,
there.
Yeah, exactly. I had to give a double take on it. Yeah, it could be as much as $12 billion or perhaps more, depending on how long it goes. And that's, again, not uncommon with big infrastructure projects like this.
The O'Hare expansion, it's going to be underway for some time until at least 2034. And we could see several new presidents during that time. So how do you think a change in administrations could affect that project?
That particular project, I think, is a little more insulated from the political whims that we've been talking about so far, especially when it comes to presidential politics, for the simple reason that a lot of those dollars for that project are coming from passengers themselves. It's much more of a partnership between the airlines and the city and the O'Hare administration. A lot of passenger facility charges. There's a lot of dollars that are put in by the airlines themselves. Again, all designed to improve the overall passenger experience. Very different from the runway reconfiguration, which preceded this, which was funded in large part by federal money.
Right.
So I do think there's always the risk that the federal government could reprioritize. But given that this is something that's meant to sort of improve the overall experience, and better running airports are good for commerce nationally, I think that's a much easier case to make politically at the federal level.
A new global terminal seems like it would probably have a bit more appeal.
Absolutely. And again, especially if it's something that's run more from the standpoint of passengers and the airlines themselves paying for it, improving the quality of the experience locally. The federal government can subsidize that, can be involved in that, but it's not a federal government responsibility as opposed to something like the runways themselves, which are about safety, about mitigating congestion, a lot of those other broader federal goals.
Gotcha. Well, Governor Pritzker has been really invested in green energy and climate technology. And there's currently a federally funded commission that's exploring the future of high-speed rail in Illinois. A Trump administration is not very likely to go in the same direction, Justin. So what kind of effects could we see there?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I think you'll see probably either some scaling back of those plans or a chance to think about how we might be able to pay for those types of investments with state and or local dollars. And it's not just in high-speed rail. You think about how much federal money has gone into things like the charging stations that we're seeing crop up all over that were funded in large part through the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. A lot of stormwater and other sorts of climate adaptation projects that were funded by the Inflation Reduction Act. I think you'll see more of a shift towards state and local dollars there. Those are high priority projects and they have economic impacts of their own. So it's not a difficult thing to justify just from an economic development standpoint. But yeah, the federal government clearly will have different priorities going forward than was under the Biden administration.
Trump threatened the University of Pennsylvania as well as other colleges on the campaign trail. This was in the midst of pro-Palestinian protests, saying that he would, quote, take away their endowments, tax advantages, and grants. if they continue to be run by what he calls communists, Marxists, fascists, and frauds. Now, certainly a president can't take away a university's endowment, but could that person take away certain types of federal funding?
Yeah, for sure. We've been talking a lot about the direct impacts, so to speak. What happens if the federal government pulls funding that they have already pledged for specific projects? In some sense, the real story here are the indirect impacts, the kinds of policy changes that you're describing here. Certainly the federal government could do more technical sorts of changes, like not allow university endowments to continue to be tax exempt, which would increase their overall cost of doing business. The federal government could do things like remove, roll back, somehow scale back the tax exemptions that are made available for state and local governments when they borrow money to do infrastructure investments. And that could have an outsized impact. And all this is happening, I think, against the broader backdrop of what happens if the Trump administration gets serious about things like tariffs on China, which would have a big impact on inflation, which would have a big impact on interest rates, which could make a lot of the kinds of projects that we're talking about a lot more expensive.
I mean, he's already said he's going to start with that pretty early on.
Absolutely. For Mayor Johnson, you're thinking about the $1.5 billion bond investment program that he has got approved last year for things like affordable housing. That gets a lot harder to do if we see interest rates increase. And interest rates at the moment are at about 30-year historical averages. They've gone up a bit. They've been cut recently, but they definitely have the potential to increase quite a bit. And I think that makes it a lot harder to do the local debt financing for a lot of these kinds of investments.
Circling back to our conversation there on green energy a moment ago, I mean, are there other industries, Justin, that you feel could be affected here where, the Trump administration will have a very different approach to federal funding than Biden has had?
Yeah, we've talked about the sort of downside of it, and that's clear, especially if in transit, in certain types of clean energy, electric vehicles. But I think there could potentially be an opportunity here. When you think about a lot of the potential for new sorts of public-private partnerships to emerge in areas like investing in stormwater infrastructure, in investing in areas like different types of permeable surfaces, different types of highways that can be less congested. I think there's the potential for different ways of thinking about reducing carbon footprint, different ways of thinking about promoting economic development through different types of clean infrastructure investments. The federal government, the Trump administration has made very clear that it has some appetite for that. We may do those projects very differently. It might be a lot more private capital. It might be leveraging federal government tax credits and other kinds of tools rather than federal grants in the way that we've been doing a lot of those investments as of late. So I think it's not all downside. I think there will be an opportunity here for advocates of those kinds of investments. I just think they're going to have to follow a different playbook to be able to make those things come to life under a Trump administration.
Well, anything that you think Governor Pritzker or Mayor Johnson could or should do right now to ensure that this federal funding continues to flow?
Yeah, Illinois is in a bit of a unique spot now. There's certainly some conversation about how Senator Durbin, will or will not finish out his term. I'm not making a prediction, but you certainly hear some things about how he may or may not be willing to continue to stick around. So Illinois, for the first time in a while, is really without really, really senior leadership within its congressional delegation. There's certainly leaders have been around some time, and maybe they step up and fill some of that void. But there's no question that we're in a different place vis-a-vis the congressional delegation than we've been in certainly for decades leading up to this point. So I think the governor takes a bigger role in that. I think that there's absolutely a case to be made that a lot of the economic development that is happening in Illinois is very consistent with the Trump administration's agenda. Again, we talked about quantum computing. We talked a lot about different types of electric vehicle manufacturing. We've talked a lot about smart manufacturing, different types of agricultural development. There's lots of things going on in Illinois that the Trump administration can get behind. But it really does mean shifting the focus pretty considerably from where it's been over the last 4 years.
Right.
And that doesn't just happen. That takes time and effort, and it's going to be something that I think our elected officials are going to have to be very deliberate about in the not-too-distant future.
Something for us to watch, certainly. We've been speaking with University of Chicago professor of public policy, Justin Marlowe. Thank you so much.
Thank you.